Hi, I'm Tori, and today I'm going to be discussing The Cat Who Walks Through Walls by Robert Heinlein. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Tom Weiner. So this was a very interesting science fiction book, and I don't think I've ever read one quite like it. It starts out very mundane. The opening scene is in a nightclub, and it almost felt like it was in a movie from the 40s to me. It was very restrained. There were things about it that were sci-fi-ish, but it felt very grounded and very much like it could be in the real world. And then as the story went on, you get to see, okay, this nightclub exists in a world that has lots of science fiction elements in it. And it turns out that the nightclub is on a space station where a bunch of people live and stuff, and it gets to be more science fiction. And then about halfway through the book, it just goes full-on science fiction and keeps getting more out there as the story goes on. So if you kind of want to be eased into science fiction, this is a very good way to do it, because it starts out so grounded and so close to our world and then gets so much more creative as the story goes on. My only problem with that is that it got more creative as the story went on, but I felt like the plot kind of unraveled a little bit, and I ended up enjoying the first part of the book more than the second part, just because, like, the story elements that were happening were good, and you were learning interesting things about this world, but it felt like you were kind of getting more removed from the characters as the story went on. But it's worth it, because this book was so quotable. I love the main character, especially in the first part of the book when the story is really focused on him. And I love the writing style of this book. It was so quotable. My favorite quotes were mostly things that the main character said, but other things that just the author put into the book were great too. I wrote down so many quotes I loved from this book. The dialogue was so great, and I loved watching the way the characters interacted with each other. I had so much fun with these characters. So if you think you might be interested in this book, I recommend that you go read it and then come back to hear my opinions. So I absolutely loved going on this adventure with Richard and Gwen/Hazel. Especially in the first part of the book, the tone was so great. They were both so dry and sarcastic, and they handled things so well. They're just in this nightclub and somebody gets shot and then it's cleaned up right away and all this stuff happens, and they're just kind of going along with their lives, and then they just decide to get married because they can. And you find out later that they have known each other for several years, but it's just a spontaneous decision that they really stick with, and I love that. I loved watching as, they get kicked out of their homes and kicked off their planet, and their space car crashes, and they have all this stuff happening to them, and they're still just a happy little couple on their honeymoon bringing their pet bonsai around. And then I liked the earlier parts when they had Bill tagging along. I was sad to see him go. I wish they would have done more with him and not just abandoned him when he started being too socialist for them, and then it turns out he was evil because of that. I would have really liked to see him, integrate into their family more and go with them. They did get other people to kind of join their family as they went along, but I just had so much fun watching them traipsing about, and wherever they go, there's always the bonsai. I also thought it was really interesting that in the universe of this book, marriage doesn't have any legal or social value, really. And so you don't need it for any legal purposes. It doesn't do anything legally. And society's kind of gotten to a point where socially you don't need to be married to do stuff. But this couple just decides they want to get married, and there's nothing legal about it. They just declare it, and then they stick with it, and they go on this fun little family. And they're not doing it for any external reasons or because anyone's making them. They're doing it just because they love each other and enjoy each other's company. And it turns out, that they lied to each other about a bunch of things, especially Gwen. She wasn't very honest at all, but Richard didn't tell her everything either. And they still get along really well. They still, it turns out that she was marrying him as part of a covert operation, but that doesn't matter because they just work through it, and they still decide that they enjoy spending time together. And true, they didn't have a particularly long marriage. They were dead within a couple weeks, but it was still really fun to watch them and fun to have that idea of marrying not for any outside reasons or because there are external forces motivating you, but just because you enjoy being married. And I thought that was a really cool way to examine that. I also liked it that at the beginning, Richard seemed so capable and so able to handle things, and Hazel was always able to handle things. She handled things well throughout the entire book, but then as you go on, you find out she's had all this help and training, and she's hundreds of years old, and that's why she could handle it so well. And I thought that was interesting too. There's been lots of complaining lately about characters being Mary Sues in books or movies, and just being great at everything for no apparent reason. And she had a reason to be great at everything. She was hundreds and hundreds of years old. She had lots of time to go through training and learn all this stuff, and that worked so well. That also meant that these characters were older. Usually when you see characters falling in love and going on an adventure, they're pretty young, and then, you know, the adventure happens and they get on with the rest of their lives. But these characters are in the middle of the rest of their lives, and they still go on an adventure, and that was so great. I loved watching how they were able to navigate out of trouble no matter what life threw at them. They were able to get out of it. And that kind of wasn't as good toward the end of the book. You know, once you find out more about the Time Core and all this stuff that's happening, it seems kind of like the characters get pushed to the back a little bit, and we don't really see Richard do much. We know that everybody wants to recruit him because he's desperate for Mission Adam Celine, but we don't really see him doing many things. And instead of being an active participant in the book, he just kind of sits there and watches things happen. And then the end of the book was so jarring, because we find out that the main guy who Richard doesn't like is really his father, which makes sense because he's like everyone's father. He's thousands of years old and has all the kids. But, you know, we get that revelation, and then we cut ahead to Richard having agreed to the mission. So we skip over him agreeing to do the mission, we skip over the mission happening, and we see everyone lying there dying. And we don't really know what changed his mind or anything, we just see them dying. And Hazel admits that she was the one who committed the murder at the beginning of the book, and it just kind of ends, and that was so jarring to me. I was listening to this as an audiobook, and I had to check to make sure there hadn't been like a glitch in the audio. I went and got a physical copy from my library to make sure I hadn't missed something, but I didn't. It just happened that way. And from a factual perspective, you have all the information you need. You know that, okay, we know that Gwen has been manipulating Richard to get him to do stuff, so she would have manipulated him into doing it by the end, you know, or she would have talked him into it. You know, she was kind of manipulative, mostly just made things happen, but she would have gotten it to happen. He agreed. They go on the mission and stuff, and you have all the information. You know, it's just a mission that failed, and so we don't really know what happens to the world after this. But from an emotional standpoint, I was so invested in these characters in the beginning of the book, and then they kind of, I wasn't as invested as time went on. They just kind of got pushed to the back, and I wanted to see them pick up the story again, and then they're just dying, and their mission is failing, and it felt so sudden, and I wanted more information. I did think that the explanation of the time travel and basically all the science fiction in this book was really interesting. It's the concept of world as myth. So they talk about how, oh, you know, religion was popular for a while and there was a creator and made the world, but that didn't really hold up. So then for a while atheism was popular and people said there was no creator, but that didn't hold up either. So then we realized that the world is just a myth, and everything that exists was created and told by someone else. So there was the whole thing where Richard and Gwen were talking about the characters she created and stuff, and then he's like, oh, this person's in real life, and it turns out the person is in real life because someone created them. And so we actually do see characters, we think we see one character get erased as the story goes on because whoever's narrating them can just erase them, and that's like the premise of this world, is that people can kind of co-create themselves. If you write a story, you will write these characters into existence, and someone has written you into existence and can write you out of existence again. And I'm not quite sure how that lines up with the whole time travel thing and how that the universe keeps splitting and there are all these different versions of reality. I guess there are different versions that authors wrote, but like the way we originally see the time travel, it's like, okay, we're going along and then it split here, and then it split again here, and then it split again here, and you think that's why there are all the different versions of reality, and people will walk up and say, hi, I'm from a world that was just like yours until 1935. But it seems like if the world is myth thing was really the premise of what was going on, then you wouldn't have to be in universes that split. You could be in different ones that were just spontaneously created differently. So maybe this whole universe we're in that split is all done by one narrator. I don't really know. I would like to find out more about that. And I know that this whole concept of world as myth is something that Robert Heinlein has gone into in other books. So I will definitely want to read some of those and get to know this world more. I just wish I could have had more time with these characters. Oh, and side note, the title is adorable, The Cat Who Walks Through Walls. But I don't think it's really that appropriate because Pixel is hardly in the book. She's just a cute little cat who shows up like toward the end of the book and hangs around for a while and then gets to die with everyone else, but like isn't really a big part of it. So I feel like the title isn't really all that tied into the story, but I'm okay with it because the title is what made me pick up the book in the first place. So I enjoyed this book a lot. I loved how quotable it was, and I loved all the adventures the characters got up to. I loved watching the characters talk to each other and interact with each other. I just felt like the ending was so abrupt, and I wished I could have had it like fleshed out a little bit more. But this was a very enjoyable book, and I will be reading more by this author.